Hey class, so here we go. Communication Theory, Chapter 1, Part B. And remember our three questions, our three main questions that we're trying to answer as we go through this material. What is communication? Why do so many miscommunications occur? And how do we minimize miscommunication? So now we're going to get into more of the nitty-gritty here. So let's move on to our next slide. A little background on the communication models, because here now we've kind of talked about some of our guiding questions and whatnot in the part A of this lecture series on the first chapter. Now we're going to get into our communication models. And the model that we really accept now in our communication field of study is that transactional model of communication that you have in your textbook in chapter 1. But that was not the first one. The first model was actually this one-way model that you see here on your screen. This is a slightly different depiction of versus the one you've got in your book, which is chapter 1. And in the 11th edition, it is on page 8. It may be it should be the same numbers if you got the one from the bookstore, the special one for EPCC, but in any case, this is figure 1.1 in your book. This one is slightly different. But let me give you a little bit of background about the communication field. So realize that we didn't always, when you went to the university or you went to college, you didn't always study communication. There weren't even communication departments. Actually, the official history of communication goes at least for the West, okay, every culture has its own history of speech, of storytelling, of developing their own language and culture. But in Western tradition, which is what we're primarily studying, we follow the Greco-Roman model. And the Greco-Roman model, actually what you studied then was rhetoric, okay, rhetoric. And rhetoric is defined as the art of public speaking, okay. It's more complex than that because I would say it's the construction of messages to achieve a particular purpose in a public space, whatever that is. So your rhetoric is a craft. You're crafting messages to either, usually 9 times out of 10, you're doing it to persuade an audience. You're selling an agenda. So our government, our political system, as you may well know, is based on that ancient Greco-Roman system. Of course, realize that of course, languages, you can get a whole degree in this with linguistics and whatnot. The study of how language developed, of course, predates rhetoric and all of that. But anyway, and so from that Greco-Roman model, and as you move through history and universities get established and whatnot, what you still studied was rhetoric. So we really didn't get communication departments as we know them now until the 20th century. And there's a few reasons for this. So let me then take us into the 20th century. So here we are, you know, in our universities, etc., communication scholars or speech scholars, rhetoricians, actually became concerned with the same question that we asked ourselves, that we're asking ourselves here at the beginning of this course, and that is, what is communication? What is this thing called communication? So a group of rhetorician scholars, right, got together right after World War II at what was called the Macy's Conference. And yes, Red Star Macy's actually sponsored the conference. Okay, so that's why it was called the Macy's Conference. And they asked themselves, what is communication? And the first model they came up with was this one-way model that you're looking at right now on your screen. And that is, once again, figure 1.1 in your book. And I want to throw in a little bit of context here, what we call rhetorical context. What was the context for these rhetoricians getting together and coming up with a model? I mean, why after World War II? Why didn't they do it in the 1700s? So there's a couple of things going on. One was World War II, and rhetoricians were particularly concerned with this because of propaganda, and because of the role of propaganda that propaganda and public speaking took in creating Germany, because Germany, of course, began the war and wanted to expand its borders, etc. And of course, you end up with Hitler, which was the other concern. And of course, Hitler was known for being an extremely charismatic speaker, and he was able to manipulate forms of media that had existed at the time to disseminate his message. And so it was very provocative, because you have to understand, at the end of World War I, Germany was really ground into the dust, both from a financial or economic perspective and a cultural perspective, right? They were defeated. So the question becomes, you have this country at rock bottom at the end of World War I that damn near takes over the world during World War II, and horrifically scapegoats and tries to commit genocide against over 6 million people, over 6 million Jewish people, the Jewish community in Germany. So how does this happen? And of course, what also makes the 20th century different from other centuries is that you have the introduction of new forms of mass media, right? In World War II, it was the radio. We didn't get TV in every household until the 50s, but the radio came to be. So this was another way, a mass medium, a way to disseminate propaganda and messages. So we have of course, we already had our print media, the newspapers and all of that. And then of course, and then when we talk about Hitler, he even used aspects of film. He was not a very large man in terms of his stature, and so they would manipulate film and have films of him going in the background when he was speaking that would make him look much larger. I don't believe it wasn't synchronous the way we do now when you go to your favorite concert and you're in the nosebleed section, so the live musician looks like they're about a half-inch tall from where you're sitting. So what do? We have these big screens that project them live so that you can see better if you couldn't afford that front row ticket. So they did aspects of this on a not so technical level with Hitler, but it wasn't synchronous. So if you take a film class, you might run into that. Anyway, I just wanted to contextualize this a little bit for you, because that's why rhetoricians became concerned with this very question. What is communication? How does it work? And what's the role of what we call mediated messages, the idea of mass media? So this first model they came up with, known as the one-way model or the Shannon-Weaver model, you got to give them some credit. It was their first try, right? So notice when they're breaking down this model, you have the sender, or in the case of your book, person A. You will also see the sender referred to as the source, which I think is also here one of your vocabulary terms in the book. So source or sender, or person A, is the person that has to take his or her thoughts, feelings, ideas, experiences, whatever it is that person wants to communicate, and has to encode them into language, body language, paralanguage, the vocal tone. And we'll get to the different codes in a few slides. But so encoding is the process of taking your ideas, your thoughts, feelings, etc., and putting them into verbal and nonverbal symbols. So that's person A or the sender. So they encode the message, and the message is what you're trying to communicate. That's the content. And that is our primary term in our communication field of study. What is the message? What message are you trying to send versus what message is actually received? So there you go. Person A, the sender or source, encodes their message, sends it across to person B or the receiver, and person B or the receiver has to take the language code, the body language, the vocal tone, all of these symbols, and has to interpret it, has to interpret the message, and by putting it back or using their own thoughts, feelings, experiences to try to decode the message and figure out what the heck did person A or the source of the message mean. Okay, so encoding and decoding, the process, right, of sending and interpreting messages in a way. So, but notice in this one-way message, in this one-way model rather, the message is just moving in one direction. If you notice, we sometimes this is also called the pipeline model because it's like a little pipeline. And if you can imagine the message is a little crumpled up piece of paper, and maybe that's what I normally do when we're passing it around the class down the line. That little paper goes from sender receiver, sender receiver, sender receiver, and out it comes at the other end, and we all live happily ever after, right? So notice under this model, the communication is being represented as linear. It moves only in one direction. There's no feedback, and person A or the sender encodes the message while person B or the receiver decodes the message, and that's it. Okay. But like I said, you got to give them some credit. It was their first try. Now, after this conference, as we do get into the 1950s and we get we not only get the radio, now we get television and the dissemination of messages through TV. Now we start getting universities and colleges start actually developing communication departments. It's not just rhetoric anymore, but we start getting communication departments in universities that are kind of a large umbrella. You still have rhetoric in there. You still have your public speaking and your study of rhetoric, and you also have, right, mass media. You have mass media. Mass communication starts to become a separate division under this umbrella. And then as we move further into the 60s, 70s, and particularly the 80s, when now we're starting to get into, not quite, but starting to get into globalization, the early, starting to get there. Women are really entering management positions and so on in the 80s, but it started a little bit before that. We also get our business and professional organization communication divisions under this communication umbrella in a lot of our universities. And so now we're very interested in studying communication within organizations and how can we improve that communication so that businesses and organizations can make more money, right? So they can be more productive. The bottom line is the bottom line, increasing that bottom line. So that's a little bit of background for this. So that was the first communication model. What happens next? The next one that is developed in these departments is what we call the interactional model or circular model. Your book refers to it as the circular model. Now this one is a little bit better. Notice the term interactional, okay, between. Inter means between, so between people. And now communication is not just this linear one-way process, it's viewed as an interactional process between people. Okay, so, and this is a little bit better because the source and the receiver take turns. So person A, or the sender, encodes the message, like we said before, takes ideas, experiences, thoughts, feelings, etc., whatever that person is trying to communicate, encodes the message into language, body language, and so on, and sends it across to good old person B, right? And good old person B, or the receiver, then takes the language code, the body language code, and so on, and has to interpret that message and decodes the message. But here's the good news with this model. It doesn't stop there, because now person B has to take their thoughts, feelings, etc., their response to person A, or the sender's message, and encode their response and send it back across to good old person A, or the sender, the initial sender. So that becomes feedback. Now guess what? Now person A isn't just the encoder anymore. Person A has to decode person B's response and encode their response, and then we end up in a feedback loop. So it's interactional. Person A encodes the message, sends it across. Person B interprets the message, decodes it, then encodes their response, sends that back across as feedback to person A. Now person A is the decoder, person A encodes. So notice now the biggest advance in this model is the recognition that person A and person B both become the sources, the senders and receivers of messages. They both are involved in the encoding and decoding process. So, all right, that's pretty good, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Oh, you send your little message to person B, how nice. Person B then responds and sends their response back across to you. And now you send your nice little response back to the receiver, and then it goes back and forth in this nice, neat little process. And that is the problem with the interactional model, is communication is still represented as a sort of nice, neat, back and forth, step-by-step process where the source and the receiver take nice, neat little turns, sending and receiving messages, encoding and decoding messages, and we all live happily ever after, right? Well, perhaps not, class. We didn't stop there, because I want to ask you a question. And I'm going on to the next slide here, which is we're gonna move into the transactional model. But before I do that, here's my question for you. How many of you come from large families? And I mean one family that lives under one roof, okay? And of course, I don't know who you are. Some of you may not. You may have 4 people in your home, as I do, plus a cat. There may just be 1 of you. There may be 2 of you, but some of you out there, I know, might come from a family of 7, 8, 9 people under one roof. Why do I ask you this question? In your family, or if you don't have a large family under one roof, think, of course, this may be kind of hard because of COVID, think of the last big get-together you had with either your friends or family, where maybe there was a group of, I don't know, 20, 30 people, or maybe you had a smaller get together because of course during the pandemic we couldn't have these big parties, but just think back. So in that large family of 7, 8, 9 people under one roof, or the big get together of 20, 30 people where people are coming in, they're going outside, they're coming in, they're going out, is communication this nice, neat little back and forth process? Person A asks a question, person B responds, then maybe person B asks a question, and it goes back and forth. Are you kidding me? Not even. So I want you to imagine you're at a big get together, right, with the outside and inside, and there's the cooler, maybe there's some coolers and kegs and whatnot outside and inside, or for those of you who prefer sodas and whatnot, whatever floats your boat. So somebody comes in during this get together, and there's 4 or 5 people maybe in the kitchen and this and that. People are spread out. Someone comes in, pops open the cooler, and is like, "Hey, where's the last Budweiser?" Well, then someone else in the room is, "Hey, be quiet. I'm trying to listen for the score here on the game." And then someone different in the room says, "Hey, do you think that, did you see our cousin with his new girlfriend? What do you think's going on there?" And then someone else responds, "Hey, was that the doorbell? Get the doorbell. I don't want to answer the door right now." And finally, after a few more people say random things, someone finally says, "I drank the last Budweiser." If you even ever get a response. So the point is, when you're in a group of people, and usually small or large, communication is usually not this neat back and forth process. The messages are flying all over the place, right? And so yeah, you get all these other messages are flying across the room before someone finally answers your question. "I drank the last Budweiser, but guess what? There's another cooler over here in the garage. Help yourself." Okay? So this is now the model that modern communication departments accept, is this transactional model. Trans means across. The messages are flying across. They're going all over the place. And that people, and that both parties, whoever's talking, it's their response. Both parties are creating the meaning of those messages, and we'll get into that sort of idea more as we move through this. But it's a transactional process, okay? Because, as your book says, because both persons are responsible for creating meaning, and both influence and are influenced by the other. Because here's another thing. Remember our guiding question: what is communication? Yeah, your book has a nice neat little definition. We'll come back to that. You can look it up yourself. But really what we're after when we communicate is shared meaning. We're trying to share meaning, okay? That's what we're doing when we're encoding and decoding. We're trying to help each other understand the message we're sending and or receiving. Okay, so it's a transaction. The messages are flying all over the place. It's across. It's not just between. And there's all these other elements that influence that communication. So under the transactional model, communication is simultaneous, circular, messy, and ongoing. So what do I mean by this? And by the way, I'm getting kind of bored of this model. I wish we'd come up with a new one. It'll be interesting to see once we even get more forms of I think mediated messages with we have computer mediated messages, right? Our emails and social media. And you know what? It might be kind of interesting, because as we develop AI, artificial intelligence, and maybe our messages are going to go through computers and perhaps robots that do have artificial intelligence, and they add their own influence to those messages. I don't know, maybe we're going to have to come up with a new model, and I have no idea what it would be called, but could be kind of interesting, class. Could be kind of interesting. So what do I mean by communication is simultaneous? That means that, and you'll notice in figure 1.3 in your book, notice person A. Now we don't have the encoding and decoding process separated by these little arrows. Person A both encodes and decodes, and person B both decodes and encodes. We are, under this model, we are receiving and sending, we're sending and receiving messages at the same time. That's what simultaneous means. It's at the same time. We are sending and receiving. We are encoding and decoding, or decoding and encoding messages at the same time. Both, and so that's why sometimes you don't see source and receiver anymore. You see person A and person B, because they are both, they switch roles. They're the source and receiver. They're sending and receiving messages simultaneously. And my question to you at this point is, how? How can I how can I be talking, right, to you and then receiving a message at the same time? Of course, right now we're not in a live classroom, so I can't see you. But I just heard the door slam in the background. Okay? And there's banging dishes in the background, aka noise. Or someone in my household, as I try to talk to you here in this PowerPoint, they may start talking to me. So all of these things, as I'm sending this message to you, this verbal message, I'm also receiving other sounds. And if you were here, if we were present in the space together, I would actually be receiving messages from you via your body language. Okay. I could, right now I can't see you. So you could be fast forwarding me already. You could be rolling your eyes. You could be falling asleep. I can't see you, so I don't know. But if we were in a classroom, I could look at your posture. I could look at your facial expressions and receive messages that way about how well you're receiving my message, right? That's your feedback. Are you understanding this? Is the person falling asleep? Do they not get it? Do they look puzzled? So that's how we can send and receive. We can encode and decode messages simultaneously, okay? Because communication is not just about language, it's also about body language and also vocal tone, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. So there you go. Both, and also, as we already mentioned, both communicators, we're not going to talk about frames of reference or fields of experience actually until part C of this chapter 1. This is kind of a long chapter, but it sets up the whole course. And then of course part D will be the ethics part, and that's what your assignment is going to deal with. But in any case, both communicators' frames of reference or fields of experience create the meanings of the messages, and we'll talk more about that in part C. So, shared meaning is created through a transactional process, and also Paul Watzlawick, who was a father of modern communication, he was a philosopher. He did a lot of other things too. He contributed to the fields of psychology, etc. One of his big famous communication axioms is one cannot not communicate. And that absolutely applies to the transactional model of communication, because communication is ongoing. You can't stop it. It's this transactional process. So you cannot not communicate. Again, class, how can that be? If you just sit down, cross your arms, and keep your mouth shut, you're not communicating, right? Wrong, because that behavior, and you with your crossed arms and keeping your mouth shut, is communicating. You know, leave me alone, I don't want to talk, I just want to listen, or I'm in a bad mood. All of that is communicated through your body language. So even choosing to be quiet with your words doesn't mean you're still not communicating. It's like they say, not making a decision is a decision. Anyway, it's a little bit like that. So moving on, here is another representation of that transactional process. That is in your book. That is not in your book, rather. It's a different representation of this transactional model. In your book, you're looking at figure 1.3. But this has almost all of it. Notice both communicators, or the sender and the receiver, involved in encoding and decoding. There's feedback, right? Because the person's response to the message becomes feedback, and we still get into this feedback loop. You have the channel, which we're going to talk about in a minute. You have noise, which we're going to talk about in a minute also. And you have the fields of experience that surrounds the communication, which we're also going to address in the part C part. So, and the only thing that's left out on this model is environment, which we'll talk about, and code. And we're coming to that right now. But this is still a pretty good little representation. You notice you also have the relationship between the communicators is going to impact the message, and the content. You know, what is contained in this message. So what codes, what's the channel richness, what codes are operating here. So there's another little diagram you can look at. Moving on. Speaking of codes, let's now break down this transactional model of communication, which, by the way, when we ask the question, what is communication? We could argue that from a communication theorist perspective, communication is this whole transactional process that we're looking at here. So let's start breaking this down a little bit. So let's first talk about codes. Now, do not confuse codes with the encoding and decoding process. That's not what we mean. Encoding and decoding is a verb. It's a process. And encoding, remember, to translate ideas, images into verbal and nonverbal symbols. Decoding to translate those verbal and nonverbal symbols back into ideas, images, etc. Okay? So interpreting. But codes is a noun. And when we talk about codes, there's typically three main codes that we use to put together into a message, right? So the first one is the one that we're all familiar with, the language or the verbal code. And this is spoken or written words that are used to communicate thoughts and emotions. This is the first opportunity, by the way, for miscommunication, and I'm going to repeat this at the end. We forget that language is a code, all right? It is a representative, agreed upon system of symbols that we use to represent certain things in reality. Think about when you're learning a language. What are the first things you learn? You typically learn the nouns. Chair, it stands for this. Table, that group of sounds stands for this object. Dog stands for this animal. Cat stands for this animal. Or gato or perro, depending upon what the language is. So we agree that our ancestors way back when, the ones who decided to put together the English, originated the English language, and another group of ancestors way back when that originated Spanish, agreed that these certain sounds put together would represent these objects or reference in reality. Okay? And it's kind of random. I mean, that's a whole nother area that you could study that's fascinating, but it's kind of random. I mean, if another group of ancestors had decided that gobbledygook would stand for, a flat surface with four legs, like a table, then we'd be calling our tables gobbledygooks, And then we get into the whole problem of what our modern tables look like versus what our ancestors considered that object to be are two different things. So anyway, so the language or verbal code, and then we have the paralanguage code. That's our vocal code. Those are the vocal elements that go along with spoken language, including your tone of voice, your pitch, your rate, your volume, and emphasis. And then the third code is what we call our nonverbal communication, the nonverbal code. These are nonverbal cues. It's also referred to as the visual code because we have to see the person's body language, and it includes all intentional and unintentional means other than writing or speaking by which a person sends a message. So your body language, your posture, your eye contact, your facial expressions, all of that fun stuff, the way you walk, right? The way you dress, your overall appearance. Is your hair perfectly brushed and groomed every day and your shoes are polished? Or does it look like you just rolled out of bed with a t-shirt and came to school or wherever you're going? So that communicates. People will assign meaning to your behaviors and to whatever you're doing, whether you like it or not. So, appearance, and then there's proxemics. Proxemics is the negotiation of space, and this is kind of fun. You know, how close are you to someone? Are you in their personal space, and how far away are you? So proxemics, the negotiation of space. Notice its relationship to the word proximity. I'm not going to go into that a lot right now because you have a whole chapter on nonverbal communication. So we'll talk more about that then. Also, we have color. What does color communicate? And this is going to be different culturally, different things we associate with color. And you know, blue, the person's moody blue, red, anger. So think about the associations sometimes that we have with color. It can communicate things. Then the temporal code. How do we treat time? And this varies from culture to culture, right? Here on the border, if the party starts at 9 o'clock, what time do you go to the party? Maybe 10, maybe 11. It's just getting going. I mean, that's just that's how we treat time. We're called down here the land of mañana, okay? Or what is it? Tiempo poco. My Spanish is muy mal, but anyway. But that's not universal class. You may go up north to, I don't know, New York, a more fast track place, and the time there is very precise. If the party starts at 9, the party starts at 9. You know, maybe you get there 9:15 at the latest. So time communicates different things. There's whole kinds of things that we communicate with time. What if you're late? What if a person is punctual and you're late all the time? That communicates a message. So temporal, how we treat time, and that sometimes varies from culture to culture. Yeah, down here, hello, party's at 9 and you get there at 9, forget it. Whoever's hosting the party is in the shower, you know, but it's still getting ready. Then there's also haptics, and haptics has to do with tactile, with touch, how we touch other people. Think of the handshake. If the handshake is firm, or you put your arm around something, or if greetings, maybe it's culturally fine to hug someone and give them a kiss on the cheek as a greeting. Other cultures, you're going to get sued for sexual harassment. So anyway, so those are our 3 basic codes. So familiarize yourself with those. And I'm going to give you a quick example of paralanguage or the vocal tone, because you know, and I hope you can hear me, or if you are part of the deaf community, you know, you can look at the transcript of this. But anyway, vote and of course sign language. Think of sign language. That's a whole nother language code, a whole nother language that builds in the paralanguage code. But anyway, so say I'm gonna do a question. I'm going to show you how these codes can change the meanings of the messages. So say the question is, so what did you do last night? Right? And the other person says, nothing. Okay. So I'm going to answer that question. I'm going to use the word nothing. I'm going to answer that question 3 times. And I want you to listen. And just by listening to my vocal code, right? My tone of voice, how does the meaning of this message change? So here we go. First person. So what did you do last night? Nothing. Okay. Next scene. So, what did you do last night? Nothing. So, what did you do last night? Nothing. Okay. So there you have it, class. You heard nothing, nothing, nothing. So what did the first nothing mean, do you think? Nothing. I really didn't do anything last night. What did the second nothing mean? Nothing, nothing. Yeah, I'm angry, perhaps, that I didn't do anything last night, right? I'm angry. You can hear it from the vocal tone. And then the third nothing, nothing. Something happened, right? Last night, something happened, perhaps a bit naughty. But anyway, so that's what we mean, how paralanguage, just your tone of voice, and notice, class, it's the same word symbol. It's the same word symbol, nothing. And yet, the meaning of that one word changes depending upon the vocal code or the paralanguage code. And you didn't have access to my body language, but you can imagine the body language, the nonverbal body language that would have gone with those three nothings. So that's just a little quick demo. Now, here's one for you. What about mixed messages? What about when the codes don't match? So when interpreting a message, which code do receivers rely on more heavily? The verbal or language code, the vocal or paralanguage code, or the visual or nonverbal code? So when you're trying to assign a meaning to a person's message and their codes are mixed up, which one do you think we rely on most? Which one do we pay the most attention to? And so again, you can't see me. I didn't do the little figure box this time, but it doesn't matter. You can listen and hear. So if I came in and I told you all, you know what, class? You did a great job on that first set of speeches. I just want to let you know to keep up the good work. And think about my body language with that. What if I'm rolling my eyes? So here I'm going to fill it in for you. What if I'm rolling my eyes, look very put out, you know, and then my voice takes on that sarcastic tone. So what's the message you receive? Boy, you did a great job on that first set of speeches. Oh, brother, keep up the good work. Not. Okay. So what message you actually receive the opposite message of what my words are saying, do you not? Because 9 times out of 10, the vocal and visual code, so the paralanguage and the body language code, will override what my words are saying when it's a mixed message. This is pretty much a way of saying actions speak louder than words. And in fact, if you look at your book, figure 1.4, you notice it argues with that little pie chart that 69% of the content of a message is actually conveyed verbally and vocally, and only 31% depends on the words. It's like, what? How can that be? But I want you to think of a time when that's not true, because we're going to challenge this pie chart a little bit. When would that not be true? When would you have to rely more on the words? Give me a situation when you would have to rely more on the language code than you would on the vocal and body language code. Anyone? Think about it. You're probably already coming up with the answer. How about now during this PowerPoint? You can't see me. I mean, if the sound of this went off, all you would have is the words, right? And then think about being on the phone with someone, or think about listening to a speaker, listening to a presenter. Yeah, maybe you could, if you didn't have access to their words, yeah, you could look at their body language. But if it's a speech or a presentation, you'd miss most of the meaning of that message if you didn't have access to the words. Or, you could tell, oh, they're excited about this part, they're bored, they're not as excited about this other part of their speech, but you would miss, if you didn't have access to that language code, you would miss it. So keep in mind that the situation, the context of the communication impacts this also. So why are we spending a bunch of time on this? So think of your 3 codes. So here's where, and this really impacts you in business, not just in business, but we're going to move on to the next term in our model, which is the channel. Now, what do we mean by channel? The channel is the medium you select to carry the message. What does that message have to go through to get to the receiver? Okay, to get to the receiver. So, and examples of this are the face-to-face channel. Now, when we're in the same time and space and we're having a face-to-face communication, technically the channel is the air. The vibrations of our voice, the visual, the light waves, all that are moving through the air, but we typically don't say that. We say face-to-face. Okay, so the face-to-face channel, a video conference, this is our any of our electronically mediated messages. So video conference is having to go through the computer, the electronics. Telephone calls, it's going through the phone. Texting, it's going through the phone. Memos, emails, social media, television, radio, letters, magazines, those are all channels. Those are all the medium. Now, we notice, class, we almost never see the word medium in its singular form. We most often see it as the plural form, which is media. So here is where we get our term, mass media. What does that message have to move through? And you're thinking there, are you still awake? You're probably thinking, who cares? What? Well, this is very important because the relationship of code and channel gives us an opportunity, opens up opportunities for miscommunication. Just like the fact that we're dealing with codes, we're dealing with a representative system, also is an opportunity for miscommunication. So what's channel richness? What channel can you use where the receiver will have access to all 3 codes? The language code, the vocal code, and the visual or body language code. Okay, so the richer the channel, arguably, there's less opportunity for miscommunication because at least the receiver has all 3 codes present. Okay, and this also impacts whether that channel is synchronous or asynchronous. Synchronous means we're in the same time and space. If we were in a live classroom, then it would be face-to-face, and the feedback is synchronous. Those messages, that communication is synchronous. It's happening in the same time and space. It's simultaneous. But right now we're using since we're in an online class, we're using an asynchronous channel. Okay, this is asynchronous. Our feedback is not going to be right away. It's delayed. And because this is a PowerPoint, you don't have access to my body language. You just have access to my voice, right? The vocal code and the words. So synchronous channels versus asynchronous. And how does this impact you? Well, you can also look at, this is a good chart to look at in your book, page 16, table 1.2, choosing the best channel to send your message. So you have to kind of think about this. If the message is very complex, it's very emotional, like you're going to fire someone, you probably want to do that face-to-face. Believe it or not. I know you don't want to see them cry and this and that, but out of respect, you really should probably do this face-to-face. If it's a complex message, and also a complex message because the people can ask questions. They can clarify the message. So this gives you some different situations. If you want that a permanent record of that message, then you want to send it through email, because now you have a record that, hello, I sent it. You know, here it is. If you didn't receive it, I've got proof that I sent it. So the channel impacts your communication, because it impacts whether or not your receiver has access to those codes. So think of a text message. What if you use the channel of a text message, what code or codes does the receiver have access to? Only the language code, right? Only the language code. That person can't see you and they cannot hear you. So there's more. That's why there's lots of opportunity for miscommunication with text messages. And I bet you all have a lot of funny stories. And so I would like for you to see, I'm going to go on to the next slide here. I would like for you to please go to videos under Blackboard and watch the Key and Peele text message confusion video. It's really funny, and it demonstrates what happens when the sender and the receiver are only using that verbal code, and what happens. So that's what that's what we mean. So that's one of the things I wanted to emphasize. And I bet you have a lot of stories. Think of your stories with text messages. I'm sure they're great. I already told you what happened to me with my poor colleague looking for the room at the wrong campus. Something else to keep in mind. The channel you use to send a message also sends a message. The channel you use to send a message also sends a message. And you're probably going, huh? What are you talking about now? Well, here's my question to you. How many of you have ever been broken up with via a text message? So the person sends you a text and it says it's over. How does that make you feel? And this may change. I don't know. Texting is so common now. Maybe this is going to change, and maybe arguably it depends on the person. But still, when I ask this question in class, 9 times out of 10, the person says, well, you know, it made me feel like, wow, they didn't respect me enough to break up with me face to face, or at least call me on the phone. Or they were a chicken, they were a coward, they couldn't break up with me face to face. Or wow, they really didn't care about me. So when you use a text to break up with someone, arguably you actually receive 2 messages. You receive the actual message, it's over, see you, see you later, see ya, wouldn't want to be you. Okay, but you also, because of the channel that they used, you also received the message, wow, you really didn't give a crap about me, did you? Or you're a little chicken, you're a coward, right? So that's one version. Now we have to ask the next question. How many of you have broken up with someone using a text message? And why did you do it? Why did you pick that channel? Maybe it is because you didn't really care about them. Or, hello, you were a coward. You didn't want to watch them cry. You didn't want to be in the same time and space. You didn't want them to cause a big scene. So, it becomes a little bit complex. You might want to think about, what channel are you using to send a message, and what does that channel also convey? So think about this. Channels can also convey formality. Think of our nice, beautiful wedding invitations. A lot of times, that if you have a nice big wedding and you can afford it, you send out those nice formal wedding invitations. Think about when you have to tell someone that someone has passed away. You typically try to do that face to face. You can't always. The person's long distance, but you try to do that face to face. So there's more opportunity for miscommunication when you use a channel that's not as rich. One or more of the codes isn't present. So here's my question for you. To minimize the potential for miscommunication, then, what channel should you use? And I'm not going to answer that. You get to answer it. And also, once again, please study that table 1.2. That's got real good advice. And listen, shall I tell you another story? Are you bored? It's going to take 9 hours to upload this darn thing. So true story, because this really is important. This is true. If we don't apply this to real life business organizational situations, this stuff is really, I don't know, it's really boring and useless unless you apply it. So thank God that I do not delete emails. Thank God the channel I used was an email. So this was a while back. So basically, the dean, it involved the dean, me, the head of another department, the head of another department, and the colleagues in that department. Okay, so this particular department was in danger of being shut down because the enrollment was low. Okay, so the person who was the head of that department, the chair of the department, had pretty much run it for years and years and years. Okay, so the dean, and I'm a newbie at the time. So the dean at the time decides they're going to put me as the head of that department so that I can build the enrollment and save it. Okay, no pressure there. Well, I'm young. I'm from actually another department at the time, but I'm dual, I have experience and degrees in both. So the dean puts me in charge of that department. Well, how happy do you think the former head of that department is? Not very, right? And so I did my best to try to smooth things over, etc. And then the other colleague in there really knew me and wanted to use me to kind of push his agenda. So anyway, that's the situation. I'll try not to make this too long. So the long and short of it is, we were in a meeting with the dean a little bit later on, and we were discussing this vote we had taken to do, I don't know, whatever it was. And the colleague that I had taken over for pipes in and says, she's leaving me out. She and the other colleagues are leaving me out, and I don't know what they're talking about, and I didn't even get to vote on this, and they're leaving me out. So, oh my God, this looks really bad, right? He's basically saying that I'm leaving him out, that I'm disrespecting him, that I didn't include him in this vote. And the dean's looking at me going, well, and I said, well, I'm pretty sure that no, I sent this memo out to everyone, but we get so many emails. Let me go back and check. Thank God, class, because I found the email. Not only had I sent this memo to him requesting his vote, he sent me back his vote. So I had proof that not only was I not leaving him out, but he had actually voted. So I was able then to go back to the dean and show him, and I didn't get in trouble. And there is a prime example of how that channel, the need for a permanent record, the email, can come in very handy. So that's my quick story there. Then what else can communicate with, what else can interfere with communication? Noise. So anything that interferes with communication by disturbing or blocking the message. And if you're falling asleep, the good news is you can pause, you can go get a snack, you can come back if you get tired during this. This is the great thing about asynchronous communication. And right now, speaking of noise, there's external noise. So that's a no-brainer. Right now, I hear clanging in the background. There might be a noisy air conditioner that interferes. You're trying to listen and someone is talking. So that's kind of a no-brainer. External noise where you can't hear the message. But then there's also, and external noise though can also be interesting too. It can also be things from the outside environment that cause internal noise. So, but let's talk about internal noise first. Internal noise is more psychological. It's your thoughts, your feelings that get in the way of the message. So if the room is too hot and you're trying to listen to the speaker or the presenter, it's hard because like, you're sitting there thinking, oh my God, it's so hot in here. And so you have a hard time concentrating. Or you're too cold. You don't feel well. You just had a fight with your best friend. So you're there trying to listen, and all you can think about is the fight you just had with your best friend. So psychological things can create internal noise. So, there can also be pressures from the external environment. So the environment's noisy. Uh, it's not a good time of day. Time of day can even, if it's 7 o'clock in the morning and you didn't get a chance, the meeting 7 o'clock in the morning and you didn't get a chance to eat breakfast, and you go to the meeting and you're sitting there the whole time, you're hungry, you're tired, you want another cup of coffee, that's all interfering with the message. That's why a lot of times at meetings, they will provide coffee, donuts, a snack, soda, something, so that to reduce that type of noise, being hungry, etc. So external noise, usually noises from the outside environment, and then of course internal can be more psychological, etc. I was going to try to refer you to that page. Yeah. And your book gives you that nice little example. Okay. Headache, daydreaming, lack of sleep, lack of knowledge. Okay. Then there's something fun, class. It's not in your book. It's called semantic noise. Now, semantics is the branch of linguistics and logic that is concerned with meaning, with word meaning, the meanings of words, and also grammatical constructions. And semantics also has to do with the fact that that one word has multiple meanings. So we could be having a conversation about, I don't know, something that involves a cross, but you're thinking the Red Cross where you volunteer, and the other person's Catholic and they're thinking of a crucifix. You've got semantic noise going on. And I'll give you another real life example. Hang in there. We're almost done with this part. This is kind of a long part, but true story. So most of you, well, all of you, well, I don't know, because I don't know who's in here. Some of you could be older, younger, or somewhere in between. But I lived through a time where you were not born with an email address. Okay, email was new. Everyone was getting their email address. It was this big, exciting thing. So my husband now, the man I'm married to, we were just dating at the time, and so we were both getting our email addresses at our respective organizations, and I was like, hey, and not just organizations, people were getting it through different servers and whatnot, AOL, etc. But so I was like, hey, I got my email address. Here's my email address. And so then he's like, yeah, I have mine too. My email is this. And he proceeded to tell me, and some of you may recognize his name. He's an English professor at Valle Verde. He proceeded to tell me that his email address was lawrencewelsh@hotmail.com. And I proceeded to get very upset. I was like, what do you mean? Your email address is lawrencewelsh@hotmail.com. Because I thought he meant hot mail, M-A-L-E. But fortunately, he's a very good communicator, and he caught on right away. He's like, no, hot mail, M-A-I-L. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that's okay then. So that was semantic noise, specifically caused by words that are homophones. They have the same sound. Homo is same, phone means sound. But semantics can also interfere with the meaning of a message when the grammatical construction is ambiguous. So check out this question here. What has the cat in its paws? What does that question mean? What has the cat in its paws? Well, actually, it's not there clear. When I first saw this question, it was, oh, well, what does the cat actually have in its paws? Like, does the cat have a mouse? Does it have a little lizard? Does it have a little tiny snake? What does, a roach? What does the cat have in its paws? A little mouse? But that's not the only way to interpret this question. It could also mean, what has the cat in its paws? What larger animal, like a dog or a coyote, has the cat in its paws? Okay, so this too is semantic noise that's caused by an ambiguous grammatical construction, because this question can mean two things. And moving on, another part of this transactional model that can impact communication is the environment. In other words, what is surrounding the context? What's the context? What's surrounding where this communication between person A, person B is taking place? So there's something we call rhetorical context. And you have to be aware of this if you're a presenter or a public speaker, because then usually you refer to world events or national events or something, or civic events, something that has just happened that influences perhaps how your audience feels, the way we're feeling, the way we may perceive messages at the time. And if you don't refer to it, you may look out of touch. So rhetorical context, say that it was the day that the tragic Walmart shooting happened here in El Paso. So if you were a public speaker and you were had to make some sort of presentation over the next few days, you would probably refer somehow to that event. So what's the context? What are the world events? Referring to the pandemic, referring to COVID-19 became part of our rhetorical context in a public presentation or speech. But environment is not just that. Environment, say you have a team meeting at work, so you have to meet as a team at work, right, with your team. Well, what's going to impact how well that team communicates? The relationships, right? Do the people like each other on that team? Do two people really despise one another? I mean, that can make the meeting really not pleasant. Are two people on that team now dating each other or sleeping with each other? Then the relationships get complicated, and maybe everyone knows the relationships, but it's unspoken, and so that can impact the whole meeting that has to do with, I don't know, the new safety protocols that are being implemented. But because of the relationships among the members of the team, that may interfere with that whole meeting and how well the messages, the actual business of the meeting is received. The time of day that a meeting or communication takes place. Late afternoon, maybe you're sleepy. How about having a 1 o'clock class? You've just eaten lunch and you have to go to your 1 o'clock class. Maybe you're tired now or sleepy, or not. So that can impact this all creates the environment. Is the room you're in or the place you're in comfortable? Is it noisy? Is it too hot? Is it too cold? Is it stressful? There's a lot going on. Maybe the room is too comfortable. So all of this environment, the environment surrounding a particular communication, can all impact how well those messages are sent and received. And what else is part of this whole process is feedback. Remember, feedback, once you've decoded that message, now you have to encode your response to the message and you send it back as feedback. And then that, you're feeding back. Without feedback, it would be very difficult for us to figure out whether or not the person B the receiver received our message the way we intended it. It would be very hard to see, did they get it? Did they get the message? Did they understand what I mean? Okay, without feedback. And feedback, again, is not just your verbal response. It could be your vocal and your body language response. So And I'm not going to talk, your book really goes into it. I'm going to save this for the listening chapter to go back more into different types of feedback and the advantages and disadvantages. What I do want to tell you is that, have you ever heard of feed forward? There's not just feedback, there's feed forward. And that's when you prepare the receiver for the message. So if I came up to you and I said, hey, you'll never guess what I did last night, I'm preparing you for the message. And you can probably tell by my paralanguage, oh, it was something good, it was exciting, right? Or what this is also feed forward. I'm glad you're sitting down. I have some bad news. Okay, that's also feed forward. But now I'm preparing you for a message that's not going to be so pleasant. And then there's self-feedback, and that's where you monitor yourself. And this depends again on how you process messages. But so when I'm talking, I can hear my own voice, right? I can hear my own voice. So that's a form of self-feedback. And this can be really distracting. I don't recommend this. I would record yourself and then listen to yourself, because if you do it as you're speaking, you can screw yourself up. If you start paying, did I just say that? Or, wow, that sounded funny. You can really kind of get yourself off track. Or, oh, if you start criticizing, self-feedbacking as you're doing it, it's going to really interfere with your ability to send the message. Now you can kind of look at your audience and adjust the way you're delivering, but that's another form of self-feedback. Is monitoring your, or oh my gosh, have you practiced a presentation in front of a mirror? That's self-feedback. That can either be helpful or really get you off track because you're looking at your body language, or you get distracted. Oh, my hair doesn't look too good today, So I just wanted to throw those out to you because you may not have been familiar with those. And here are the concepts. We're wrapping up. This is a long one for me too. But fortunately, you can stop and start this PowerPoint. So here are the concepts to get from this one. And the good news is, class, the next two parts, C and D, will not be as long as this one. So one of the concepts is you cannot not communicate. Another one is, note from a communication theory perspective that communication is an action. Notice the interactional model and the transactional model. Words are actions, particularly in public spaces. And this is really something I think that we're really learning in our democracy right now, that when you're sending a message, whether it's social media, whether it's in a public space, that is an action. And also think of our civil rights during the civil rights movement. When we change things in our society, we call it a movement. So in a democracy, our weapons are supposed to be words, and those words persuading people to think a certain way, to change laws, to understand things in a certain way, to value certain things. Those communications are actions. Okay. And the next is that when we communicate, especially through the language code, we are involved in symbolic interaction. Language is an agreed upon representative system of symbols. This is an opportunity for miscommunication because technically, class, we are representing reality with our words. Or are we also constructing reality? Because language is generative. Once you have language that represents certain objects in space and time, like tables and chairs and whatever is around you, you can also generate new ideas like freedom and democracy and God and different philosophies, existentialism. Now language is generative. You can generate and talk about ideas that you can't actually see, hear, touch, and so that's another thing to think about. And once again, Noise and the relationship between code and channel, whether or not you have access to all of the codes, also create opportunities for miscommunication. So take a look at that Key and Peele video. I think you'll get a kick out of it. It does have cuss words, I'm going to warn you, but it's a good demo. So finally, stay tuned for the next part, because I hope you're starting to see that communication, this transactional process, is rather complex, and all kinds of things impact the meaning of that message. Both people are creating the meaning of that message, and the environment, noise, the relationship of code and channel, all sorts of things interact to impact how that message is sent and received, the meaning of that message. But we still haven't gotten to the kicker, and that is frame of reference or fields of experience. So stay tuned as we continue to answer this question. What is this thing called communication? Why do so many miscommunications occur? How can we minimize it? And then as we move through this course, how it applies to the business and professional context. So take it easy, and I'll talk to you next time.